In this video, we're looking into when therapy is and when it isn't confidential. We're going to define confidentiality, look how it differs from privacy, and learn more about all of these topics along the way. My name is Keegan. I recently graduated with a master's degree in counseling. I'm making videos like this to help you prepare for the NCE, CPCE, or whatever counseling exam you might be taking. To begin, let's define confidentiality and privacy. When I use the word confidentiality, I'm referring to information that a client tells me as the therapist. That information is then confidential. I can't share it with other people. As much as I may want to tell someone how great the client is doing in therapy, or this really cool thing that I heard, or something that's very interesting, I can't say it. That said, there are some specific situations that we're going to talk about a little bit more where we can break confidentiality and where we will say information. But that's a little bit later in the video here. Privacy relates to one's ability or right to control the disclosure of information. This might include what they share, who they share it with, and how they share it. Clients have a right to privacy in therapy. This means that we shouldn't ask clients to disclose any information to us that isn't important or relevant to the therapeutic process or to what we need to accomplish in therapy. This also means that clients don't have to share anything that they don't want to. The ACA Code of Ethics that really relates to this is B.1.B. So if we think about this, clients have a right to privacy. They don't have to share anything they don't want to, and we shouldn't ask them to share anything that isn't relevant to therapy. They also have the right to confidentiality, meaning that whatever they tell us, we're not going to go around and share with anyone else. In Ethical Code B.1.C, the ACA says that counselors disclose information only with appropriate consent or with sound legal or ethical justification. In my first session with clients, I always tell them, what we talk about in therapy stays in therapy. And then I go into how there are some limits to that though. And this is where then I talk about some of the limits of confidentiality. I recently made a video about Terasoft warnings, and we cover some of these limitations in that video, I think in more detail than we're going to get into it here. But the gist of it is that if they're a risk of harm to themselves, to someone else, or if I know of a situation where someone might be at harm, those are times where I may have to let the appropriate people know, whoever the appropriate people might be in that situation. And since I'm working toward independent licensure, I also let them know that I'm being supervised and that my supervisor is someone who's going to have more of an idea of what I'm doing and who I'm seeing. I also let my clients know that since they're being seen in a medical setting, other providers in the hospital system may have the ability to read the notes from our sessions as well if they have a reason to. Related to confidentiality, those are some of the key things that I'm going to be talking about with all my clients. And then there might be other ones that are more specific to the situation. For example, a teenager who I'm seeing, I would also discuss confidentiality related to their parents or guardians and how that works in therapy. And that's a conversation that I'm going to usually have the guardians present for. So I'll talk to the teen and the guardian at the same time so that we're all on the same page and that we can discuss this more also. So as we move on with confidentiality, it's important to understand that the client holds confidentiality, meaning the client is the one who decides when the information is or is not shared. This often brings up the question though, what happens when a client dies? If they've passed away, can we share that information then? As code B.3.F says, counselors protect confidentiality of deceased clients consistent with legal requirements and the documented preferences of the client. This means that after a client dies, we cannot discuss what they've told us, except of course in those situations where there's some legal something going on that would require us to disclose this information. So in those situations, should that happen, I would encourage someone to consult with colleagues who may have gone through a similar situation and to check with a lawyer or the legal department for their organization to see how best to handle those situations. The other piece of this is that the ACA says that we can disclose information dependent on the client's documented preferences. So in some cases, we may see a client who's terminally ill and who is seeing us to help process that information and make the end of their life the best that it can be. In situations like that, it wouldn't be unheard of for the client to have a preference for what happens with what we discuss in therapy. So if their family members or loved ones want to know something that was discussed or what was discussed in counseling, they may want that shared or they may not want that shared. And so in those situations, this is another time where I'd say check with your organization, see what their policies are for this. If they have a legal department or lawyers that you can contact or your board, contact them for advice, and as well as consult with colleagues to see how best to handle those situations, because they're not that common, I would say, but I'm sure that they do come up for many. Confidentiality can get a bit more complicated in the group setting. So before we get to that information, if you're finding this video helpful, please help me out by giving it a like and subscribing so that you don't miss any future videos. As we know, therapy doesn't always happen between the therapist and a client. Sometimes there's more people involved. It might be a couple, a family, or a group setting, and in these situations, confidentiality can get a bit more complicated. No matter what the setting is, confidentiality doesn't change for the therapist. We treat all of that information as confidential and don't disclose it. However, when there's someone else in the room, whether it's with a couple or more people in a family setting or even more people possibly in a group setting, we can't really control these other people. We can set the expectation that a group will be confidential, that what they hear in the group is not going to be disclosed. They're not going to be telling other people. However, this can be hard to enforce. For us as therapists, if we breach confidentiality inappropriately, our licenses could get revoked, we could get called in front of the Board of Ethics. Consequences like that can act as really good deterrents so that therapists are continuing to be ethical by maintaining confidentiality for clients. However, for other group participants, perhaps the most significant consequence that we could enact is to terminate them from the group or remove them from the group setting or not allow them to come into counseling sessions. That said, we should make everyone in the group aware that we are expecting confidentiality, but that it can't be guaranteed. So we can't say with 100% certainty that they will maintain the confidentiality of the group. So overall, we've hit many different ways that confidentiality may come up commonly for us in practice. However, there are some other times where confidentiality may come up too, and we really have only scratched the surface. For example, we could talk about confidentiality with documentation. Most likely we're going to need to document our sessions in some way, shape, or form, and so we may need to have that conversation with clients too to let them know how they're going to be documented, where that documentation is going to be stored or how it's going to be stored. And we also need to be mindful that we're documenting everything that we need to and should be documenting, but also that that documentation could get into the wrong person's hands and could inadvertently breach confidentiality. Another thing we could talk about with confidentiality is who's going to be paying for sessions. In most cases, an insurance company is going to be the payer. They're going to be the one that's covering the costs of the majority of the therapy session. Therefore, the insurance company may say that they need specific information so that they can pay for these sessions. Clients may need to know this or may want to know this, and so we should have an understanding of how that works for what we're doing, as some people may not want the insurance company to have this information and may choose to pay out of pocket instead. We should also be prepared to have conversations with clients who are minors or who may not be able to give informed consent on their own, and should be able to talk to them about what information can be disclosed to what people. If someone else is giving the consent for that person to participate, how much or what information is that person then entitled to know about the sessions? As you continue to better understand confidentiality, reading the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics is probably not going to be the most thrilling read you've ever had in your life, but I would highly recommend it as it can be very helpful to understand many of the different ways that confidentiality can come up and what they could look like and what the Code of Ethics says is the appropriate way to handle them. But most likely you're going to have some other questions about confidentiality after this video. So please make sure that you leave those questions in the comments so I can do my best to answer them either in a reply or in another upcoming video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.